And we get going. Okay, so this is a vocabulary tuto. And we're going to have a look at to drive or conduire, or you might know the verb rouler as well, which is a more familiar way of saying it. Now, the reason I chose this is because this is something that people sometimes get mixed up because it doesn't actually work in the same way as it does in English. Let me give some examples. So quite often people say, they want to say to me, oh, I drove to the shops, or, I drove across France. I drove to see my friends. We don't really use conduire or rouler in the same way in French as we would do in English for those kinds of expressions. So let's have a look. So went by car is far better than drove. So you could say quite simply, je suis allé en voiture. You don't really need the en voiture bit because it's not so important to say that you went by car unless you specifically want to say that I drove, I didn't take the bus. I drove, I didn't take the train. Or I drove, I didn't walk. So we use it to say I went from A to B. So I drove to see my friends. But in French, you don't use it in the same way. So you would just use aller for that. But let's have a look at some other ways you could say that. So, je suis allé au magasin en voiture. So if you wanted to be really clear that you went by car and you didn't do it by, didn't walk or cycle or whatever, you could just say, je suis allé au magasin en voiture. Or you could just say, je suis allé au magasin. And then I drove across France. J'ai traversé. So I traveled across, really. J'ai traversé la France en voiture. Again, if you really wanted to make it clear that you did it by car rather than by train or bike or whatever it was. So that's you're making that point. And if you just want to say, I drove to see my friends, you just say, I went. So, je suis allé voir mes amis. And anybody who's been learning with me any time at all will know that I can't stand visiter, to go and see people. So this would be what you'd say to go and see people. Drove to see them, just went to see them. So, je suis allé voir mes amis. So when do we use conduire then? Because obviously it's a verb that means to drive. So let's have a look at some examples. So we could say, en Angleterre, on conduit sur la gauche. Yeah, so in England, we drive on the left. Yeah, that would be a good way to use it. I could say about myself, je conduis une Honda. So I drive a Honda. Je préfère conduire que prendre le bus. Yeah, now we're making the difference, aren't we, between a different mode of transport. So I prefer to drive than to take the bus. Il conduisait à 80 km à l'heure. So he was driving at 80 kilometers an hour. Or you can say how somebody is, their skills. Elle conduit bien. Elle conduit bien. She drives well. So there are probably lots more. And these were the ones that I could think of off the top of my head. There's probably lots more. But I think the important thing for you to remember from this is that we don't really use it in this sense like we do in English. That's the main thing. And you can just rely, and it's quite nice because you could just rely on these very simple verbs once you know them. Aller and voir and traverser, quite simple verbs. So just to reiterate, je conduis, not je conduis chez ma copine. That, you can't say that. I drive to my friends. Je vais chez ma copine, and if you want to be really clear that it was by car, en voiture. All right, everybody okay for me to scroll on a little bit? Okay. So what about giving a lift? This is another little area of difficulty. So I'll drive you to the shops, give you a lift, come and pick you up, that kind of thing. So if you want to say I want to give you a lift, it's a different verb. Je t'emmène au magasin. Je t'emmène au magasin. I mean, I suppose you could, at a push, say je te conduis, but it doesn't really sound right. So this is the way, so I'll give you a lift. I'll drive you to the shops. Those kinds of things. So it's wrapped up in this. So je t'emmène au magasin. And then I thought, well, let's balance this out against coming to collect someone. So je viens te chercher. I'll come and collect you. So chercher is to look for. It's also to collect in all the meanings. If you were collecting a parcel or anything like that, chercher is to collect. So, je viens te chercher. I'll come and collect you. Je passe te prendre. Passer is the same sort of sense of aller, really. I'm going to come round to your house. That's what it means. I'll come round to your house or come round to wherever you are. I'll come to you. Te prendre, to come to take you. And then a slightly more a higher register way of saying it. Je te récupère. I was just going to say, what do I mean by higher register? So these are sort of like normal, everyday kind of language. And when I say higher register, it's a bit posher way of saying it. But of course, you can use all of them. Now, what can we associate with driving? So associer avec la conduite. Okay, so what can we associate with it? So il faut un permis de conduire et une assurance. And actually, I could add to that et une carte grise. Oh, sorry. Une carte grise. So that's your driving license, your insurance, and your logbook. Une carte grise is the logbook. And in France, it certainly was the case. I'm sure it hasn't changed. You have to have those papers on you in the car whenever you take the car out. I don't know if that's changed, but it used to be the case. So then we've got le conducteur, la conductrice. So there we go. So we got another name for female drivers. So le conducteur, la conductrice. And then to start the car, this is a different verb from, it's not commencer. On démarre. So démarrer is the infinitive, ER verb. So le conducteur, la conductrice démarre sa voiture. So starts, turns on their car. Another way you could say it is il met le moteur en marche. So mettre en marche would be the infinitive, is to turn anything on. So we've got two verbs here that can be used in any context to turn something on. Démarrer, to switch on, to turn on. Mettre en marche, turn on, switch on. Excellent. And then the opposite, in a car sense, I don't think it would work in any other. Il coupe le contact. And you actually pronounce that T. Il coupe le contact. So if you're stopped by a police officer and they say couper le contact, I mean switch off the engine. Of course, that's not going to happen to you. You could, the opposite again is the mettre le contact. So if you want to say, is it switched on? You could say, t'as mis le contact? And then, il attache met sa ceinture. So you either attach or put on your seatbelt. Ta ceinture. And then, il avance, va en avant. So, il avance is va en avant, going forwards. Can I just point out that the en avant is specific to this example. If you're just saying before in your normal conversation, all you need is the avant. It doesn't always go with en. Okay, but in this sentence, we need it. So, il va en avant. Il recule, go backwards. Reculer is to go backwards, take a backward step. And then the way to say to reverse is va, or aller, obviously, en marche arrière. En marche arrière is to reverse. You can use these in other contexts as well. Nice. And then we're just going to finish off because there's so many words. This isn't even the full list. So many words in French for voiture, or la voiture. By the way, can I just say that auto is not one of the ones in this list? Not because it isn't a French word for car, but it's so outdated that nobody uses it. So we don't really refer to cars being auto, but you can call it une caisse, une bagnole, une poubelle, which you know what that is, a bin. So that's when you're sort of like not very respectful about that car. Une berline. Now I thought for ages that this was just referring to German cars, but it actually means hatchback. It's a hatchback. Un pot de yaourt. I think that's probably not very respectful about the car. Now this is a bit rude. Un tape-cul. It means it's a bit like it's bumping into your ass, basically. So it's probably because it's been all sort of like crunched at the front, I would imagine, or the back. You know, like French people drive, park, sorry. You know, the parking is bounce off the one in the front, bounce off the one behind if you're in a big city. So I suspect that's where that comes from. And yeah, if someone calls your car this, they're not really being very polite. Une trottinette, which is a scooter, as in a child's scooter. Yeah. But the reason why it's useful to know these words is these are the kinds of things that you will hear people saying in films and on television programs. And you might think, what are they talking about the scooter when they're obviously looking at a car? Très bien. Anybody got any questions? Want me to go back over any part of that at all?